I've been doing a really good job this year of hobbying efficiently, and that means getting it right the first time. My newer 40k armies, my Dark Eldar, my Tyranids, my Death Guard, they have all been one and done. There's an expression, let's do it once and do it right, and I've actually been keeping to that for my newer 40k armies. And to get my Death Guard correct, I've been thinking about what can I do to make them even awesomer so that when they show up on the tabletop, it's an even more special experience. And I think the clear answer to that is custom terrain. This terrain. Nurgle's gift is the gift that keeps on giving. And I've really been enjoying the video game Chaos Gate Demon Hunters, and it's really fun to like digitally walk through a landscape covered in really cool Nurgle terrain, so I really want to do that in real life. I have some fun plague saplings with ooey gooey mucus stretched between to provide some cover, plague trees with giant eyeballs held in a bouquet of crab-like fingers, a plague furnace cooking up some new pestilence, and the Maw of Despair, a big ol' mouth ready to spew the most wonderful and vile concoctions of the god of plague. And all of these pieces were printed out of beautiful Soraya resin, the best 3D printing resin. If you want to try it for yourself, you can find it linked in the description below. All of this terrain will be available on our Patreon for the month of May. They say that April showers bring May flowers, and the flowers be sproutin'. And there's some really, really weird looking flowers. I gave all the pieces a Rattle Can Prime of black. I like Rattle Can Primer for my terrain, it makes it a little bit more survivable on the tabletop. Then I zenithaled each piece with white paint through my airbrush. I usually use white ink, but I don't own enough to do all these models, and my airbrush is freshly cleaned, so there shouldn't be much speckling. Whew, that took the better part of a bottle of white paint, but it is all zenithaled and looking pretty. Now comes the tricky part. For my Death Guard, I use the same 8 colors, the same discontinued 8 colors. I love how they look, I love their consistency. This is all I'll ever use. But I don't necessarily want to use it up on terrain. What I've got in my hand here is diamonds. I gotta figure out a way to make these very unique, one-of-a-kind paints not be so one-of-a-kind. 3 of my Death Guard colors are gray, white, and a black wash. I don't even have to think about these. Any paint from any range will be fine for replicating these, but the opaque, mustardy yellow, rusty red, and pink will be slightly trickier. I put some different yellows I own onto my palette and started mixing them together, trying to find whatever blend is in the original paint. It's definitely got some brown in there somewhere, but finding the right combo is a challenge. I put the color onto my hand and let it dry so I could compare what my mix looks like next to the original. On the palette, I thought I nailed it perfectly, but seeing it on my hand, it's kinda off. I added some red-brown in the mix and tried again. It's a little closer, but still wrong. Too red, not enough orange. A little more fussing got me closer, and after way more trial and error than I expected, I got it about right. Turns out a healthy amount of P3 Heartfire with just a splash of desert yellow and fur brown is the trick. I ran my experiment for the other 2 colors and discovered that Reaper Paint Rust Brown and Chestnut Brown mixed 50-50 gets me darn close to the original reddish color. And the color I thought would be the easiest was actually really hard, pink. How different can pinks be? It turns out, very different. I tried every pinkish paint in my collection, and a mix of huge miniatures Pink Blossom and Dorado Skin ended up getting me the closest. The last 2 colors are transparent blue and green, and I got really lucky with these because I have to use inks and washes to replicate these, and I don't have nearly as extensive a collection of these. For the green, Dollar Roundy dark green and a little splash of striking scorpion green makes a good match, and for the blue, huge miniatures blue wash and just a drop of oceanic blue nailed it. I never care much about color accuracy. I typically use whatever colors are closest to me, and I use paints from every different manufacturer under the sun, and my models always look decently consistent model to model, but for my Death Guard, accuracy is a necessity. Well, that was a lot trickier than I thought it was gonna be. It was really hard to color match some of these colors, and every single time I had it just about perfect, I would think, just needs a little touch of yellow, just a little bit of extra daylight. But every yellow paint I own is a mix, because that's how wargaming paints are. That's how they get them to be the right colors. But I think I've got it down. I'm gonna paint one of the smaller pieces and then compare it to one of my Death Guard guys to see how close I got. I filled up an entire palette mixing paints, so I started fresh, making myself big batches of each counterfeit Death Guard color. Every time I start a Death Guard, I water down my paints a lot and just start slapping them down at random, letting the dark gods pick what parts of the model are going to be which colors. A little bit of yellow here, some red over here, green on top, slap down some blue right over everything. This randomness gives me my base, and I kind of paint myself into a problem, and then the next step is to fix that problem, making these random patterns into something purposeful. I took my white paint and dry brushed the model to quickly highlight all the details and desaturate my colors. It also does a good job of blending my colors. They all highlight all the way up to pure white. Now I can glaze my color back in. For these ball-shaped tanks, I want the upper parts to be bright saturated yellow and the bottom half of each tank to be a rusty red. Like the whole surface is red, but the light is reflecting off of the red, turning it yellow. I did this for every detail, bringing back the saturation with my original colors and being purposeful of where the colors start and stop, mixing white paint into the colors to make them into highlights, and I applied these to the top part of the model. It's looking really, really good, and I was really worried that the colors just wouldn't quite be right and it'd be like noticeably different from my Death Guard, but when I hold up one of my little dudes, it's pretty darn close. I do feel like I see a little bit something, or it could just be the desaturation of larger surfaces and larger panels being painted in the same colors, but I really, really like where it's headed and I'm excited to try it out on one of the big boys. The eye of Nurgle sees all. I decided to use the little furnace as a guide on how to paint the big furnace. Kind of a Papa Bear Baby Bear kind of project. I glazed on my colors, working quickly so that all the colors stay wet and I can easily blend them into one another. I love my Death Guard because of how much it taught me about painting. I had to blend, glaze, and not focus on putting every color in its place, but focus on values. I made green pouring out of the top of the smokestack, dribbling down the sides, and my favorite part of this guy is the big ol' eye. I used blue to shade the lower half of the eye and a very watery green glaze to tint the white base coat an unsettling hue. Now that all my colors are down, I broke out the white paint again and gave the whole model a dry brushing. Now it's time to finish this guy. I started out with my biggest, nastiest paintbrush, reapplying my color mixes with a ton of water and a little bit of flow improvers as they fill into the cracks. I slapped this paint down and then switched to a second paintbrush with damp bristles, and I pushed and pulled the paint around the model. This was great because I didn't have to wash my paintbrush, so I didn't waste any paint. Then I switched to a large brush in better shape and started picking out some of the details and focusing on adding smaller amounts of paint to more specific spots, like the rust on the intestines and highlighting up the yellow armor. I dipped plenty of green into all the cracks, and the green next to the yellow makes these stand out strong. It helps to blur the line between organic and machine. Then I switched to a real paintbrush for his eyes. Glazing white paint on the top half, I want the eyes to be the brightest part of the mini. I painted the iris blue and glazed orange around the edge, putting this on his bulging veins too. Then I added more thin lines of blue and light blue exploding out from the middle to give him a beautiful and disgusting eye. And speaking of disgusting, the belly of the tank has this big grinning crack, and I highlighted every tooth and glazed green, blue, and brown over them to tint them just right. For a building, he has surprisingly good teeth. The Miasmic Malignifier. This thing reminds me a lot of Chaos Gate Demon Hunter. Sometimes on your missions, you'll be tasked with taking out Nurgle terrain pieces. And so what ends up happening at the end of your mission is you've got all of your Grey Knight dudes just standing around this giant thing, all taking turns whacking it with their hammers. It's actually kind of comical when you like take a step back and look at what's happening, but in the moment you feel like an ultra badass with your power hammers and like lightning claws just stabbing into this building. My Death Guard have been a really interesting project to work on because I do them very normally, nothing but acrylic paint and water. And that's not usually how I paint. I love the airbrush, I love contrast paint, speed paint, washes, even dabbled with oil painting, but with these guys, every time I come across a challenge that I would normally reach for one of my special effects, I just have to make it work with normal acrylic paint, and I kind of discover it's not that big a deal. A couple of layers of wet blending, a couple of layers of glazing can do all of the same effects, but I don't have to reach for any of those special tools. And being constrained by, these are the only 8 colors I can use, is definitely like a fun challenge to get the creative juices flowing. And speaking of creative juices, I want to see just how much I can cheat within my limited palette. I have 2 plague trees, and I want to see if I can speed up the process using the airbrush. One by one, I made up each color and sprayed them onto the trees. The fine mist the airbrush makes is very similar to the wet blending I was doing with my paintbrushes. It does have a different look, but it's pretty close. I gave both my little trees a heavy dry brushing of white, and then it's time to paint. I glazed yellow over the green and blue to make the tree trunk warmer and more saturated, glazing black in between the roots to outline them. Then I put blue into the mouth of the tree. Every Nurgle thing always has a mouth where there shouldn't be a mouth. Can the tree talk? What would he say? I mixed my red and black together to get it brown, and then I put this over the black outlines, darkening them and adding colors so that the tree wasn't so desaturated. Now for those fingers. I glazed wet red paint over the claws, and once that was dry, I reached for the airbrush. I sprayed yellow paint right over the fingers, and this made a lovely transition of yellow into creepy cooked crab. I dry brushed more white paint over the teeth and glazed green into the cracks. Then it was time to make the all-seeing eye. I painted the iris blue and veins orange and glazed brown and blue over the lower half to make a transition. Then I painted the middle of each eye with many lines of light blue and added some white dots to make it look reflective. I like to think that when a plague is getting out of hand, the nurgle tree starts sprouting, and those big old eyes are literally the eyes of Nurgle watching all of the mortals as they despair. And of course, he's watching from the plague homeworld of Bubonicus. Yes, the plague planet is literally called Bubonicus, and it sounds like a really fun time, because Nurgle demons actually enjoy the plague and the pestilence and the rotting. And so literally it's a giant planet-wide zombie rave. 24/7, just millions and billions of shambling corpses all singing and dancing and rotting. It sounds like a really fun time. But speaking of having a really fun time, it's time to take a trip to the Great Pit of Cocoon. Leave a comment if you know what that is. I have this big old mouth in 2 halves to make the painting easier. I wonder if it's like a surface creature, like a mushroom, or if there's an enormous demon abomination under the surface. I glazed on my colors, and instead of dry brushing, I went right ahead and glazed over top of my base coats. On the lips of this abomination, I want to add in some detail, so I painted a row of lines running down each edge, and I made lots of small dots to make the skin look rough. I decided that the skin of this creature would be warm, so I only used mixes of my yellow and red, and I didn't touch these areas with blue or green. Now for the eyes of this behemoth. I glazed blue on the underside of each eye, and then I put a solid blue over the iris, painting many small lines of yellow ring in the center. The eye is looking pretty good, but I need to make it look like it belongs growing out the side of the mouth. I used a pink to highlight around the socket and brown glazing to blend it in. On the bottom of the mouth, there's another mouth. This one I picked out with green, like it's a baby mouth plant that's still a seedling. I dry brushed extra pink over the tongue and made a line of blue running down the center with some small dots of white, as if there's light glistening off of the taste buds. I picked out the teeth, and I was thinking of a good way to do the goo. I have a green glaze on there now, and I sprayed yellow from above and a dry brushing of warm white over top. The perfection of the airbrush helps sell the sticky goo stretched tight between the crab branches. And on those branches, I glazed brown and red near the base. I slid the parts together with a little super glue, and he is finished. This guy is ready to give some models a big ol' wet kiss. I think a good rule for it would be if a model moves within 6 inches, it has to take a hazardous check. Now, it's pretty gross already, but I have one idea to make all of these terrain pieces even grosser. All of these pieces have a lot of eyes and tongues, but right now they're pretty flat in finish. I want to change that. I gave everything a coat of satin varnish to protect the paint and to keep the colors vibrant because I want to make the wet parts look truly wet. I could use gloss varnish, but I want the wetness to look thick, and so UV cure resin will be the trick. I took a paintbrush I didn't care about destroying and pushed around the wet resin. This stuff is about the consistency of shampoo. It's pretty thick, so once I had the eye coated, I hit it with my UV lamp to lock it into position. I went around hitting every eyeball. The UV resin cures like glass and smooths over the cracks, giving these spots a different texture to the rest of the model in addition to a different finish. Nurgle has a very specific style, kind of like the orcs. I feel like orcs in Death Guard make for some really good looking terrain. Oh, these guys look sticky. And I want to see what they look like with the army. I achieved my goal of making Chaos Gate Demon Hunters in real life. Also, just a note about Chaos Gate Demon Hunters, why are Nurgle the bad guys? I mean, arguably, the landscapes become much more interesting and beautiful when they're covered in Nurgle goodness, other than just landscape after landscape of barren industrial wastelands. I think Nurgle are arguably the good guys of that game. And speaking of Nurgle, while I was putting together this terrain, I worked on my 2,000 point Nurgle list, and I'm getting darn close to having a tabletop ready Nurgle army, complete with Nurgle terrain. My favorite piece is the Sarlacc pit. It's just so big and monstrous and is absolutely going to be the focal point of my games of Death Guard. And speaking of my games of Death Guard, I have a Death Guard army. I also have a Grey Knight army. I actually have kind of a big Grey Knight army. It's in a box right now, unpainted, but I have a lot of projects going on right now. But not this project. This project is done and it is available on our Patreon for the month of May if you want to check out this terrain. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching.